If you're looking to expand to the US, it's probably too late. That is, you should, people in accelerators who ultimately believe on day one that their business will be global, or at least EU and North America, you should be thinking that you're born local, but your goal is to grow global. And to do that, you need to be thinking about global markets from day one. Everything from the technology is there software or hardware translatable into multiple languages, or we're thinking about regulatory issues and whatever in whatever country we're going to be in. Have we started on day one thinking about the distinctions between the two markets? It's really easy to, particularly if you're starting in Germany, to think about German markets local and then think about expanding globally later. That's usually cost you about 2 or 3x the amount of effort, versus if you just run the thought experiment is, no, let's spend a week planning about what's a global company look like, and what do we need to know, and who do we need to kind of get to advise us about what's the differences between Germany and the US in technology and marketing and sales and in positioning and branding and whatever, and build that from day one. And when I hear, oh, let's expand, and it's because Americans are the ultimate idiots when they do this, because the local market is big enough, then they go, oh, let's go to EU. I guess it's all the same. No, it's not. French buy different than Germans, which buy different than the English, etc. And not understanding that just provides an enormous waste of time and energy. And of course you can do that. Of course you could expand internationally. But the advice I'm trying to give everybody in an incubator is, before you say, okay, let's go write code and start selling to Germany, no, spend a week and figure out what's it going to take to be a global company 2 years from now, and what should we invest in today, either people or talent or technology, that will allow us to seamlessly do this when it's time to get bigger. I was lucky enough to be mentored by one of them, who unfortunately passed away way too early. As a woman named Catherine Gould was one of the earliest women VCs, and there were others, but Catherine actually was one of the 5 first women venture capitalists. I got to tell you a very funny Catherine story, which I never appreciated until decades later. When I knew Catherine, as I knew her as a recruiter and then a VC, and then she was on my board, and then just became a good friend. And when Catherine was a venture capitalist, she was always getting, honored as, woman VC of the year and whatever. And she would always turn these awards down. This is back in the 80s and 90s. And I said, Catherine, I remember this exact conversation. Why do you turn these awards down? And she looked at me in a great Catherine way. She said, Steve, I don't want to be known as the best woman VC. I want to be known as the best VC. And of course, nowadays you kind of go, well, why, of course. But so she brought just a different perspective to almost everything we did. And, Silicon Valley, certainly in the 20th century, was a high testosterone kind of guys, macho thing. And Catherine was as tough or as smart as the guys, but she just had a different sensibility. And I think that always made our conversations much more productive. Catherine, was a really interesting mix. She had a degree in physics from University of Chicago, and eventually was on their board of trustees. But her early part of her career, she was a recruiter. And so she could read people and personalities. And so she invested in people as much as she invested in markets and tech, even though she understood markets and tech as well as, most of the tech people. But I remember a great conversation. Actually, it's funny you ask. So, after seeing a ton of entrepreneurs late in my career, you finally get some perspective about people's personalities. And I had finally noticed that, a disproportionate number of at least Silicon Valley CEOs come from dysfunctional families. They grew up in chaos and uncertainty and whatever, and their skill was just as a survival skill. And the few that did survive was to be able to just shut down everything that was necessary or everything that wasn't necessary for survival, and just focus on those few things that were. And that was also true for people who came from, villages in India and China and made that long trek in both emotional and career. And so they all had that kind of skill set. And I had never seen that written anywhere, that there really was kind of the cruelest but most effective training ground for successful founders. And so one day I'm having a casual conversation with Catherine. I said, Catherine, did you ever notice? And I went through the story, and she looked at me and this cold stare and said, Steve, why do you think I invested in you? Um, and then she said, did you ever look at the rest of my portfolio? They're all like you. You all have something to prove besides these other skill sets. And so you asked me about a Catherine story, and that was, I think, one of the most insightful ones. But we went on later on after, she almost fired me in my last company, which was a disaster. But later on we became friendly, so friendly our families would go on vacations together, etc. But so the roles had kind of changed as we both got later in our career. But in the 20th century, I don't have to tell you, but women in the Silicon Valley had to be twice as smart, work twice as hard, etc. And so, several of them became role models for me. Adele Goldberg, Donna Dubinsky, who's still kind of a friend who did Palm, the VP of sales at Epiphany, who then became the CEO and is now on some British telecoms board, Karen Richardson, all have that characteristic. I even married one of them. My wife was a Stanford MBA, much smarter than I am. I just happened to be maybe a little less risk averse because I was dumber. I always thought, at least in my career, that if you hired a bunch of these women who were just not, again, back in the 20th century, appreciated, you actually got a force multiplier inside your organization, because they, as I said, certainly the bell curve was kind of on the side of much smarter and work much harder than to kind of compete in what was then a boys' club. I hate to admit how many decades of experience I've had in the Valley. I'll tell you, when I first came out, it was a white boys club with, boat shoes. And when Vinod Khosla became a venture capitalist, people would point to him as the first Indian venture capitalist, let alone, and then women, and then whatever. Silicon Valley still isn't, quote, a meritocracy, but the decades I've had has given me a perspective of, there's been massive changes in both the ethnic and gender makeup. It's obviously it's nowhere near the 50% it needs to be, and we have a long way to go. It certainly doesn't represent the demographic mix of state of California or the United States. And I'll tell you another story on this, even one that was lately. I started my class at Stanford with a woman named Ann Miraco, who's now partner at Floodgate, but she was at first my teaching assistant and then my co-instructor. So I started teaching with a woman co-instructor, but over a decade, I just brought in other venture capitalists and other, until we looked around and said all the instructors are male, and the makeup of the class was like 20% women, where at Stanford, that's not the mix at the university. And so we had Mara Hershenson, who is a great woman VC at Pear Ventures. And Mara said, well, you're using language that's a real turnoff to women. Well, I'm using the same language I've always used. Well, and I remember Mara saying, perhaps that's the problem. And so we explicitly, just at Stanford, did explicit women and minority outreaches. And I'm proud to say, because the excuse always used to be, well, it's just whatever the pipeline is, and so we're just representative of the pipeline. And Mark pointed out is that might not be the case. It might be that you're actually unconsciously, I mean, there was no conscious discrimination, but unconsciously setting up the language that says it ain't for you. And so she had women only recruiting sessions and whatever. And I'm proud to tell you that in all the classes I teach, the balance is pretty close to 50-50. And it was a great experiment to me to when people say, oh, it's about the pipeline, there's not enough women or people of color in the pipeline. I now go say, no, I think maybe you're not making it attractive, and perhaps we ought to actually make specific outreaches. If you think about innovation entrepreneurship and startups, it's all speaking in the language of win and kill and lose. And, and I'm not saying those exact words, but battles and fights and whatever, rather than collaboration and whatever is that, the historic Silicon Valley boys club of, startups where they all looked like, the Fight Club, and yeah, there is a thread that says that is one successful model. What I've learned over time is that's not the only successful model. But that was the model we tended to both invest in the Valley and then kind of recruit for, and then say, implicitly that this is what it takes. The phrase, do you got what it takes, or Marine Corps of, whatever. Well, there are kind of gender biases on the other side of what women didn't find that particularly attractive to when that says, well, you're obviously not talking about me or collaboration or whatever. And of course, once they get in the class, they kick ass as better than the guys do. So, but it was just getting them to believe that this was for them. And I've just been, and of course I've been trying to get Mar to write up what she's done, which I can't get her to do, but it's just was a real education for me, that all it took was, and also just so obvious, but people building incubators and accelerators should think about this as well. Having a guy lead the women's session is the wrong thing, but also trying to attract people of color without having someone of color leading those sessions going, no. So we went after the Black students group and the Latino students group and the, whatever, to kind of get the right balance in the class, and surprise, people kind of respond to people like them, where you lower the barrier of, this isn't for me, to at least see that maybe it is. This is also an age thing. I mean, I'm sure to my kids that, duh, dad, but to somebody who grew up in that all boys white shoe culture in the Valley, saying, well, it's all about the pipeline, we just reflect what's coming into us, actually running the experiment, and within one semester of finding out, well, that simply wasn't true. Well, great, okay, well, that I was always more than happy to have a diverse mix of entrepreneurs, but I'm the assumptions I had about what the cause was about not having that was just simply wrong. And that if you make even just a minimal effort, I mean, it didn't take a lot to change the mix. And I think, entrepreneurship is better for it, culture is better for it, society is obviously better for it, is once we do that. And that goes back to your questions about women and balance in the entrepreneurial pool. That it wouldn't take much effort for VCs and others and incubators and accelerators to kind of make those outreach efforts, and you could dramatically change that balance. The problem is, of course, in all countries, all this stuff is unregulated, and it just is up to those people who are running those organizations to realize that they can make more money or have better outcomes. And I think at this rate, it will take time, but eventually, I think we'll get there. So COVID has kind of changed the nature of what an innovation cluster is in Western democracies, though interestingly enough, not in China, right? Where you still had people physically meeting in Northwest Beijing or Pearl River Valley, et cetera. We're running a giant science experiment now, but about what happens when your staff could be anywhere in the world, which gives you a bigger recruiting pool. And if you're an investor, your companies could be anywhere in the world. But what happens when that physical kind of, we can meet for lunch and whatever just isn't as intense? I mean, was historically for thousands of years the nature of a physical cluster. where not only the core industry, but all the ancillary functions, in our case, legal and finance and whatever, all sat in the same place. And, Silicon Valley was and Boston and San Diego for life sciences were the original US clusters for physical spaces. We're running this experiment now that says what happens when that's no longer the primary reason they exist. I don't know. That's going to be interesting for all of us, is the answer. And plus, California has some specific issues about homelessness. Prices of housing has, become unaffordable. But now all of a sudden, the largest companies, Google, Facebook, et cetera, are telling people they don't physically need to be here to work. Are these clusters going to disappear as a physical thing and become virtual and compete with physical clusters in China? Don't know.